Hi everyone, and welcome to today's session. We are MBS Academy, and our mission is to bring digital technology closer to all business professionals. We teach courses in digital technology, digital transformation, and digital risk in order to make everyone more comfortable and better at their jobs by using digital tools and to manage digital associated risks really well. My name is Mario and I'm your co-host for today. Here we also have several members of our team. Miss Antonia, who is responsible for the banking sector in Malaysia, Brunei Darussalam, and Indonesia.
Hi.
Also, Mr. Ivan Spasov, responsible for the government and telecommunications sector in the Gulf Cooperating Council countries.
Hi guys, it will be a pleasure meeting you today.
Ms. Metani Ganesan, who is responsible for the government and telecommunications sector in Malaysia, and who is also running the polls in this session.
Hi guys.
And Ms. Jessica Antoni, who is our producer for today.
Hello everyone.
Today we have with us Dr. Grace Mui, who will be talking about liquid cash flow management. Dr. Grace has received her PhD from the University of Queensland in Australia in 2010 and has been working with large multinational companies and also teaching at undergraduate and postgraduate levels in Malaysia, Australia, and China. So with that, Dr. Grace, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming today. Today, we want to talk about liquid cash flows in the age of the COVID-19 pandemic. Now, with this pandemic and that's been happening for quite a number of months, it's interesting to see how the world has really slowed down. And in terms of the world slowing down, it raises another issue, the issue of how we are going to get back to life after the pandemic. And we have seen that different governments around the world have started opening the doors. Unfortunately, in countries such as China and South Korea, who were quite successful in managing the COVID-19 pandemic, unfortunately, they are facing a second wave. Now, this has an impact on business. It means that it is not yet time to start business again. And if that's the case, then the question is, what will happen to our cash flows? If there are no cash inflows, but there are cash outflows, then at some point or another, businesses may not be able to survive this pandemic. Now, in today's session, I'm going to take a different view. I'm not going to talk so much about the pandemic, but I'm going to talk about how we manage liquid cash flows from the data analytics perspective. When most people think about data analytics, we think of people who are PhD students or all these data scientists sitting in universities. Now, this is a picture of the university where I did my PhD. And unfortunately, I did not spend so much time outdoors because I was spending more time staring at the large computer screen, looking at rows and rows and rows and columns of data, as well as hundreds of pages of text, just analyzing all of that manually and also with different types of software. Now, when it comes to data analytics, which is a part of data science, you will find that the data scientists will talk about the coding, programming, and the statistical analysis. And well, basically, this is what happens to our brain when we have to think about it too much. But the reality is, when we talk about data analytics, everybody can do data analytics. It's like having a car. If you have a car, if you have a valid driving license first, and you have a car, then you can actually drive your car around. Now, on the other hand, you have people who are Formula One race car drivers. These race car drivers actually are trained and have the skills to drive those fancy sports cars on a special track that is way, way, way much more superior than the roads that we have, even the best roads that we have in our cities. So if you think about data analytics, just remember that anybody with a valid driver's license can drive a car. So anybody who has some data analytics training can perform data analytics. However, only the data scientists can do the high-level analytics, as we have been seeing in this COVID-19 pandemic, where every day we get reports from the Malaysian Ministry of Health Director General, or even Dr. Fauci, the American version of the Malaysian Health Director General, and in the US. And we find that they are making predictions of when the COVID-19 pandemic will peak in different states in the US, in different parts of the country, among different people groups, different subclasses of people. Now, the reason they can do that is because they are actually applying very high-level analytics. Today, we are going to look at accounting analytics. So with accounting analytics, we are using accounting data to solve a business problem. And we want accountants and business owners, auditors, to have good data to make effective decisions. The data can either be quantitative or qualitative. In this COVID-19 pandemic, a question that has been asked in the early weeks of the pandemic is whether businesses can survive this health crisis. But as time went on, people are beginning to talk not just about business survival, but they are beginning to talk about business sustainability, looking for opportunities for my business to thrive in this health crisis. Now, before we think of all the different opportunities that your business can move into, we need to ask the fundamental question: how can my business thrive in this health crisis? And a fundamental answer is that we need to start by managing liquid cash flows. So when we talk about cash flows that are liquid, these are cash flows in the short term and the medium term. Now, liquidity talks about how easy it is to convert an asset into cash. Now, we have an example of two assets. You have a factory and you have a vehicle. When we talk about how easy it is to convert to cash, we're talking about how easy it is to sell the factory or the vehicle. It is much easier to sell the vehicle because it is, well, it's not as expensive as buying a factory or selling off a factory. And it's easier to move that, can drive it off. The new buyer can drive it off anywhere. But with a factory remains in its place, and a factory comes with the land and all the different fixtures and fittings and machinery within the factory. So it is not as easy to convert the factory into cash. It's not as easy to sell as it is to sell a vehicle. So when it comes to effective liquid cash flow management, what should we look at? We need to look at something called working capital. We need to manage this working capital to release the cash flows to for our business. Now, when we talk about working capital, we need to start by defining it. Working capital is capital that is working to generate more cash. Generating more cash is very important during this pandemic. Now, let's look at the elements of working capital. First, we have the receivables. This is what your customers owe you. Then we have the inventory, which talks about the product that we have to sell. Sometimes in making the product, we may actually have, you may have in raw materials inventory. For example, if you think about McDonald's, you have the different parts of the product, different parts of the hamburger. You have the bread, you have the meat, you have the vegetables, you have the sauces, and those individual products need to be put together to make a finished product, the burger itself. Now, so you do have raw materials inventory, which may or may not be sellable at this point of time. during the pandemic, or you may have to produce something, put your raw materials together to produce a product that is a finished good that can be sold to the market. And then we have our payables. Payables is what you owe your suppliers. Let's take a poll at this point. In 2019, how much time on average does it take to receive payment from your customers?
Hi everyone, you should see a poll pop up on your screen now. If you don't, please let us know in the chat. Okay, you'll see the results being shared on your screen. Back to you, Grace.
Now, if you look very carefully, you will notice that nobody pays within a month. Now, usually companies tend to be a bit more generous. Credit terms can go as can be as short as 30 days, or it can be as long as 60 days. But we find that in 2019, companies were paying between 4 to 5 months. The majority of companies, from the participants that were polled, your comments were that it takes 4 to 5 months to receive your payment. Now, this is very interesting because in 2019, there were signs of a slowdown in the global economy. So I'm not very surprised by these results, that even in 2019, you can see a slowdown, not just in the global economy, but definitely in different economies around the world. Shall we go on to the next question? In the first 4 months of 2020, how much time on average does it take to receive payments from your customers? So now the focus is on the first 4 months of 2020.
Once again, you should see a poll on your screen. Please let us know if you don't see it.
Right, what we see is that payments tend to take a bit longer now. It has taken, so the average of 4 to 5 months is now an average of 6 to 12 months, or a majority of 6 to 12 months. Now, there definitely has been a slowdown in business, not only in Malaysia and in Australia, but all around the world. Right, let's continue. Coming back to this issue of working capital. With working capital, there were 3 elements. There were your receivables, your inventory, and your payables. Let's start with the payables. The payables cycle begins with your business purchasing inventory from a supplier. And the cycle ends when you pay the supplier. So there is a cash outflow in the payable cycle. Now, with the inventory cycle, which is the second cycle to kick in, you start off by receiving the inventory that you purchased earlier from the supplier, and production ends when the finished product is ready for sale. So the inventory cycle is actually the production cycle. And we have the final cycle, the receivable cycle, where the customer orders products and you deliver. Usually we deliver the products to the customer first. And eventually, at some point in time, the customer pays. When the customer pays, there's a cash inflow. When we focus on the cash inflow and the cash outflow, we notice that there's a difference in terms of timing. Now, if your business continues on this cycle where you have cash outflows before you have cash inflows, we can end up with a business that is going bankrupt. So we need to shorten the gap or close the gap between the cash outflow and the cash inflow. By doing that, we will use an accounting analytic method to look at the number of days. So we are looking at time in terms of days. So for the payable cycle, we want to know how many days does it take to pay the supplier. And for the inventory cycle, we want to know how many days does it take to produce the product. For the receivable cycle, we want to know how many days it takes to receive money from the customer. So you notice again, there's the number of days it takes to pay the supplier, where there's the cash outflow, and the number of days it takes to receive money from the customer, which is the cash inflow. The number of days it takes to pay the supplier is what we refer to as days payable. And the days inventory refers to the number of days it takes to produce the product. And days receivable is the number of days it takes to receive money from the customer. Now, how do we calculate these three different formulas, these three different figures? The days payable figure is calculated by taking 365, which is the number of days in a year. Now, if it is a leap year, you can change the number to 366 days. And you multiply the number of days in a year, 365, with the payables. So the amount that you will owe, that you owe your suppliers at one point in time, divided by your purchases throughout the entire period of time. The second formula is the days inventory formula, where you take the same 365 days and you multiply that by the inventory you have at one point of time. So the inventory, let's say at the 31st of March, 2020, which is the end of the first quarter of 2020, and you divide that by the cost of goods sold. The cost of goods sold, also known as the cost of sales, relates to the cost to produce, market, and sell a product. The third calculation is days receivable. When we have days receivable, we have the same 365 days multiplied by receivables, the amount your customers now owe you, divided by your sales for that period of time. So what we see here is that payables, inventory, and receivables are recorded at one point in time. So it could be the end of a period, or it could actually be an average figure. This is where you take an opening balance and a closing balance, add them up and divide it by 2. For purchases, cost of goods sold, and sales, these are your items that stretch over a period of time. So that's the difference between these two categories of items. Let's look at an example. If we have payables of 2,500, purchases of 20,000, our days payable is approximately 46 days. When our inventory is $2,500, cost of goods sold 24,000, then our days inventory is 38 days. We will do the same with days receivable, where we have receivables of 3,000 and sales of 18,000 to give us approximately 61 days of days receivable. Now, we put all this information together. Earlier, we saw that working capital was made up of days receivable, and then you have days inventory. You add these two figures together, and you take away days payable. And the difference is the cash conversion cycle. Now, this is a quantitative analytic. Once we have information such as this 53 days, the next question we want to ask ourselves is, how do we manage the gap between the cash outflows and the inflows represented by the cash conversion cycle? In other words, how do we reduce the cash conversion cycle? So instead of 53 days, can we reduce it to less than 53 days? Now, this cash conversion cycle shows you the gap between the cash outflows and cash inflows. And the key question we need to ask is, how can we reduce this cash conversion cycle? In order to reduce this cash conversion cycle, we can either, 1, increase days payable, 2, reduce your days inventory, which is your production cycle. However, we are limited, the business is always limited by human capital, so the number of labor hours, as well as machine hours if machinery is used to produce a product. And we can reduce days receivable. So we have looked at the quantitative calculation of the cash conversion cycle, which was 53 days. And we looked at the mathematical way to reduce these the cash conversion cycle, which is to reduce by reducing days inventory, reducing days receivable, or increasing days payable. Now, let's look at the qualitative aspect of how we can reduce the cash conversion cycle. And we will start off with our production cycle, our days inventory, because it is something within our business control. The most important thing to managing days inventory, which is our production cycle, is to look at capacity planning. So the key is to reduce the number of days to produce inventory. Now, if your inventory requires human labor and machine labor, or sometimes human labor more than machine labor, or the other way around, we need to plan our production cycle based on the number of machine hours or labor hours, depending on which one is the more dominant figure, more dominant process, whether you use more machinery or you use more labor. Now, the problem with reducing days inventory is there is a limit to how much you can reduce it, because businesses have limited resources in terms of human capital as well as machinery. So let's look at reducing days receivable. Now, before we go on to this, did you notice that in the poll questions, the first 2 poll questions, I asked I asked about how long it takes for your customers to pay you. Now, why the focus on customers? Because customers, or the days receivable, relates to the number of days it takes for your customers to pay you. In other words, the focus is actually on your cash inflow. You have less control over your cash inflow compared to your cash outflow. Now, when you look at your cash inflow, you need to ask yourself, if it's taking too long, perhaps we should offer one-off special discounts for settlement. Now, you need to be very, very careful with this. You need to make it very clear to your customers that this is a special one-off discount for the COVID-19 pandemic, just to appreciate them and to remind them that, yes, I still care for you. You are my customer. I care for you. And I am concerned that you are facing financial difficulty as well. So I offer you this one-off special COVID-19 discount to help you manage your resources. Now, be very careful about making it seem as if these discounts will go on for a period of time. The reason is because if you keep offering discounts, too many discounts, your customers may get the idea that you are heading towards bankruptcy. And if they feel that you are moving towards bankruptcy, or there is a possibility of your company closing down for reasons other than bankruptcy, there is a chance that they may decide not to pay you at all. So please be very careful about this option. Now, the other option is to use invoice factoring. Now, this is very similar to what a supplier does when they allow for credit card payments. Now, let's think of going to the shops and paying with your credit card. When you buy some things from a particular supplier and you use your credit card, who is responsible for collecting the cash from you? It is actually not the supplier, but the credit card company. So the credit card company is now bearing the risk that you will not be able to pay, or you will not pay the full amount. So you have to remember that when you use factoring, when your business uses factoring as a way to reduce days receivable, you also have to consider that there are transaction fees related to invoice factoring because you're using a third-party service. And you also have to consider that there is a risk of not getting the full payment from the company. Now, not just because of the transaction fees, but because they're not able to collect the full amount from the customer. So please read the terms and conditions of the contract very, very carefully. Now, if and only if your customers raise the issue of installment payments, if and only if they raise this matter, then allow for negotiations. The negotiations must end up with both the customer and your business as the supplier benefiting. It must be a win-win situation. At the end of the day, you are still focusing on getting the cash inflows into the business. Now, what risks does your company bear? Whenever you sell items on credit, you will always have the risk of bad debts, which is the risk that customers will default on payment. Now, that is just a risk, an inherent risk of doing business. And there's also a risk that you're not able to collect debts in a timely manner. As such, if you find that a customer may not be able to pay you within a period of time, a fixed period of time, this is where you can start negotiating, not just the discounts, but also the installment payments. At the end of the day, your end game is to get the cash flowing into your business. The other thing you can do is increase days payable. And this is done by doing the reverse of what we talked about earlier, which is to negotiate longer credit terms. So the first thing you can do with your creditors is to negotiate longer credit terms. And if they decide, no, we can't give you the longer credit terms, at least negotiate for installment payments, as long as you slow down the cash outflow. So the game, in terms of the cash flows, the end game has to be getting your cash flows into your business. So getting your cash flows into your business at a faster rate and slowing down the cash outflows as they flow out of the business. Now, the risk that you need to consider is not something that your business as the customer will bear, but it is the risk that the creditor will bear. Now, the creditor faces the risk of the customer not paying or the customer not paying on time. However, if the creditor decides to initiate a creditor's winding up, this will be an expensive process because of the legal fees involved. It will be very expensive for the creditor, so there is a very low possibility of this happening. And it is the creditor who faces the risk of not being able to collect from their customers, which is really a reverse of what we saw earlier when we talked about days receivable. At the crux of the issue, the heart of the issue in terms of managing cash flows is to actually manage your supply chain relationships. Whenever you have good relationships with your suppliers and your customers, they can definitely contribute to a reduced cash conversion cycle because that good relationship allows you to discuss with them, negotiate installment payments, negotiate discounts with them, negotiate different methods for them to pay you faster if they're your receivables, or for you to pay your creditors a little bit slower, or to have a little bit more time to pay your creditors. During the pandemic, a key issue that came up about the supply chain is about overseas or domestic suppliers and customers. So we have the issue where countries had different standards in terms of the lockdown. And in some countries, delivery was still allowed to happen. In some countries, it was not allowed to happen. So in some cases, we found that you cannot actually rely on overseas suppliers for your goods. I heard of a few businesses who had to cancel orders because they couldn't get their goods from overseas to arrive on time. And you may have experienced this when you were ordering goods online. Now, in terms of domestic suppliers and customers, it is also an issue in some countries. Well, even in Malaysia, there was a time where there was a little bit confusion about the movement control order, and nobody was really sure about whether delivery trucks could cross interstate borders to deliver goods. And unfortunately, most of our vegetables come from the highlands. So most Malaysians were without fresh vegetables for a while, and there were stories where, because interstate travel was not allowed, or nobody really understood to what level it was not allowed, we could not actually receive produce from the highlands. So the risks associated with managing supply relationships will be the access to supply, access to sufficient supply of the right quality, and access to supply, and the ability to supply. So now we not only receive the supply, but we need to supply to our customers as well. Now, let's do another quick poll question. How will your business operation be affected should your customers delay payment? Choose the most important, the one that adds the most pressure, or you can choose all that apply.
You should see a poll pop up on your screen. You're allowed to choose more than one answer for this. Let us know in the chat if you do not get or do not see the poll on your screen. Okay, thank you very much.
Yeah. Now, we noticed that there's, in terms of the delay of payment to employees, well, there are strict regulations in Malaysia about retrenching employees. That's not allowed in Malaysia unless you have very good reason that you can prove to the government that you have to close down your business, and you have to get rid of all your employees. Now, of course, that is quite an extreme measure, but that is not allowed in Malaysia. So that's not too much of an issue in Malaysia. The main issues here are pressure to your cash flow and the delay of payment to suppliers. Oops. Now, the other considerations that we have about managing our liquid cash flows is where we have multiple products, multiple suppliers, and multiple customers. We can apply accounting analytics for each product, supplier, and customer. Actually, that's what Amazon does. And a lot of people talk about what Amazon does, but they don't actually tell you how you can do it for your own business. So I have told you how to calculate the cash conversion cycle. And the three components of the cash conversion cycle is actually, can be applied for every product, every supplier, and every customer. So this will give you information on which suppliers are more generous with credit terms and which ones are not so generous.
Excuse me, Dr. Grace, can you share your screen? We cannot see the slides.
Okay, sorry. Okay, let me do that again. Okay, oops, can you see that?
No.
Let me try again. Yeah?
No, I cannot see them.
Okay. Oops, I've lost you also. Right. We'll have to do it the other way around then. Okay. Now, when multiple products, multiple suppliers, and multiple customers, we can apply the analytics for each product, each customer, each supplier. And from there, we can determine which suppliers are more generous with credit terms and which customers are paying within a reasonable time period. So if in previously, before 2020, you allow giving them a 30-day or 60-day time frame to pay, perhaps you may have to consider lengthening it a little bit more during this season. Now, and you can also get information of how long you need to hold your inventory, meaning keep your inventory within your business before you sell it off, because there are other costs involved with keeping the inventory. Now, let's look at a quick example. Let's look at this data summary. Now, we have 5 customers here. We have information about the receivables, meaning the amount they owe your business at one point in time, and the sales that you have made to these particular customers throughout the 3-month period from 1st of January to 31st March 2020. Now, just looking at the information, just looking at the receivables and sales figures, and you will see the percentage of the receivables and the percentage of the sales. Which customer do you think is best in terms of sales? Now, the first thing that you would do is look at sales, the sales figures. Now, who has the highest sales? Now, the answer is Acme Corp. They bought $64,200 worth of goods from your business just in 3 months. That's a pretty good figure. Now, what about the amount owing at the end of the period? That means who owes you less? Who owes you the least? And if you look at these 5 receivables, the answer would definitely be Excellent Limited. That's just looking at receivables and sales. But in data analytics, we look at the relationships in data. So what we saw earlier with the 3 different formulas, and specifically the formula for days receivable, is we looked at the relationship between receivables and sales in terms of the number of days. So if we add in a new column, days receivable, and we want to ask the question, which customer is the best in terms of days receivable? We notice that it is actually not Acme Corp, who had the largest sales, or Excellent Limited, who owed the smallest amount, the least amount of money at the end of the period, but it is actually Besta Company. And if you look very carefully at all the figures in terms of the days receivable, you will notice that Besta Company pays you within 34 days. But Excellent Limited, although they only owe you $2,000, it takes them 146 days for them to pay. And although they owe the least amount, they have the longest days receivable figure. So with the days receivable calculation, what we have is we are looking at the relationship between receivables and sales in terms of the number of days. And we get very, very different results. But that's data analytics for you, looking at the relationships in data and making sense of it. Now, once you have these quantitative figures, then we will look at the qualitative measures that we can take to overcome this problem. Now, what if we have multiple customers and suppliers for one product? So let's say in terms of days receivable, we have 2 customers One pays you in 34 days and another one pays you in 61 days. And we have two suppliers. One pays in 46 days and the other one pays in 55 days. Now, we can actually find out what is the shortest time, shortest cash conversion cycle, and the longest cash conversion cycle. So with the shortest cash conversion cycle, what we need to do is to reduce the cash conversion cycle by increasing days payable. So we take the highest figure, and reducing days receivable. We take the lower figure. And we end up with a cash conversion cycle of 17 days. That is very, very optimistic. Now, on the other hand, we have the pessimistic value, in this case, which is 56 days. And this comes from the longest cash conversion cycle, where we take the highest days receivable and the lowest days payable, which gives us the 53 days. So there is a difference of, well, between the 17 days and the 53 days. So you have the shortest time and the longest time, the pessimistic and the most optimistic cash conversion cycle figures. Now let's have a short discussion in our breakout rooms, and let's discuss this question. Post-pandemic, what is the top concern for your business operation? Okay. Okay, let me share the screen with you again. Now, what we had a very good discussion about the post-pandemic concerns, and really it's about doing business differently. We can start with looking at cash flows within the business, and we start by looking really at the liquid cash flows. Now, there are other analytics for other less liquid assets and liabilities, but that's a story for another day. So in conclusion to today's session, accounting analytics applied to liquid cash flows provides information about your timing, the timing of cash inflows and cash outflows. Once you know the timing, you know where are the potential shortages and surpluses. So save during the surpluses, and at least you will have something for the shortages. And an important thing is to focus on your customer payment trends, which we mentioned earlier. And of course, the quantitative data that you get just by doing the calculation for the days payable, days receivable, and days inventory, and you combine that together to get the cash conversion cycle, that is the quantitative data that you have to decide which ones of the relevant qualitative approaches that we discussed earlier can be used to solve the cash flow problem in the short term and the medium term. So these are the steps I would recommend that you focus on at this point of time to make sure that you have enough liquid cash flows, sufficient liquid cash flows to move forward in your business. Thank you.
Thank you for joining us. Please let us know what you think by doing this small poll. All right, over to you, Mario.
Cannot hear Mario.
Sorry. Yep, I'm muted. We have a couple of minutes for Q&A. If somebody would like to share some questions or share some opinions in relation to what we have been discussing today with Dr. Grace. You can use the chat. Or your mic. No specific comments?
Yes. With the, there's a good question from Injek Sukman. This is an excellent topic to open up into further areas of concern. Yes, this really is the starting point. Once you consider the liquid cash flows within your organization, then the interim and long-term issues will be to look at your other assets, your less liquid assets, like that factory that I mentioned at the beginning. You will need to consider your human labor. You will need to consider your liabilities, and you need to consider the leases that you have, and because you will have a lease asset and a lease liability to deal with. And you need to look into not just the financial statement items, but really from there, then you look into your business processes. you will need to look into your supply chain. So this is really the starting point. Liquid cash flows is really the starting point of other issues that businesses need to consider for business sustainability. Are there any other questions?
Okay, well, let me thank Dr. Grace for the very interesting presentation. Just to let you know, today's session has been recorded and you will receive a link to the video together with the slides. We look forward to seeing you at our next sessions. Tomorrow, we have a session on securing your home networks, which is becoming more and more topical in the current climate, simply because a lot more people are working from home now, and looking at various articles that appear around the place, it seems like the trend will continue regardless of whether we have the lockdowns or not. Organizations know how to run distributed workforces now, and a lot of people will probably expect to be able to work from home 2 or 3 days a week. Not to mention the fact that it will be a really good opportunity for employers to reduce some of the overheads associated with office space and utilities bills. So tomorrow we'll be talking about protecting the home network, same time and same place online. Look forward to seeing you all there. Bye for now.
Bye.